Welcome back to the second course stream on the travels of Langston Hughes. So before we get into the text, let's recap the kind of questions we like to ask ourselves. So, to what degree is the work a product of the language and culture that produced it? What kind of image does it project of the cultures or countries Langston Hughes is traveling to? What larger socio-historic phenomena is the work responding to or a product of? What ultimately motivates the act of traveling? And then, more specific, why did an African American writer travel to Moscow and then larger parts of Asia in the 1930s? Why did he write an account of what he experienced? What kind of account? How does his work differ from readings of previous weeks in terms of focus, style, audience, depiction of people he meets? What can his work tell us about 1930s Germany, the Soviet Union, China, Japan, and the US? What kind of picture or critique does he paint of his times and the places he visits? And finally, how do we as 21st century travelers react to Langston Hughes' account? And to what degree does he challenge or enlarge our views of the Soviet Union? So here is a map of Europe from the 1930s, and I wanted to show you his trajectory. So he arrived from New York on board the Bremen, and Bremen, of course, is the name of a port city in Germany here. So he disembarked, and he took a train to Berlin. Berlin is right there. And then he took another train to Stettin, which is now in Poland. It used to be in Germany. And he took a ferry all across the Baltic Sea to Helsinki. And here he would have taken a train that took him to Moscow. And then later on, he also tells us that he travels to Odessa, right, which is down here. And then from there on into the Soviet Union and to China. So his first stop then, after getting off the Bremen, is Berlin. And I think he has some really interesting observations about Berlin. He says, in Berlin, Negroes were received at hotels without question. So we settled down to await visas. We ate in any restaurant we could afford. In the German capital, I could not help but remember my recent experiences in the South of the United States, right? That precedes his travels to Europe. He was traveling in the South on a lecture tour, with restaurants that served whites only, and auto camps all across America that refused to rent me a cabin in which to sleep. That's motels, right? Nevertheless, in spite of racial freedom, Berlin seemed to me a wretched city. Its beautiful buildings and wide avenues in the center of the town were ringed with gray slums. And then a little lower he writes, the pathos and poverty of Berlin's low-priced market in bodies depressed me. He writes about prostitution there. As a seaman, I had been in many ports and had spent a year in Paris working on Rue Pigalle, but I had not seen anywhere people so desperate as these walkers of the night streets in Berlin. 1932, the year that he passed through Berlin, was actually also an election year in Germany, a very fateful election year. And it was an election that eventually brought Hitler to power and his National Socialist Party, the NSDAP. And even though Hitler had not an absolute majority in the election, eventually he did end up chancellor and made himself dictator. But I think what is really interesting, I pulled up some election posters from that year. So we have here on the left a poster from the Nazi Party, and then here next to it we have a poster from the Communist Party. And both actually essentially have a similar message. The National Socialists said, we're going to give you work and freedom and bread. And the communists say, the last piece of bread will be stolen from these children by the capitalists, right? So we see hunger and poverty really must have been very prevalent in Berlin at the time, and that both the extreme right and the extreme left essentially made that an election topic. Interestingly, the party that sort of stood between these two, the Social Democrats, Germany's oldest party, does not have a message that foregrounds poverty, but rather it warns the electorate of voting either fascism, that is, the Nazi party, or communism, because they think that both of these parties, both the Nazi party and the communists that were aligned to essentially Stalinism in the Soviet Union, would ultimately deprive people of liberty, of freedom. European artists also explored the subject of extreme poverty and inequality in Germany and other European cities in the 1930s, which of course was also a time of huge economic hardship. The World Depression hit Germany particularly hard. Here you have a woodblock print by an artist called Franz Mazarel. He was originally from Belgium, which captures poverty and the extreme inequality. And I think, this image still speaks to us, or probably again speaks to us, maybe especially so in San Francisco, where, of course, at this moment in time, we also see that extreme inequality and extreme poverty among parts of society that are left behind. So I think it's really interesting that Langston Hughes focuses on that, but that also, and to me that was actually almost a little surprising, how he comments on the racial freedom in Berlin, and that race was not an issue there, and that he could stay pretty much anywhere. He then, of course, takes a boat and goes to Stettin. Here's a postcard of Stettin from the 1930s, which then and now was a busy port for ferries across the Baltic Sea. And he writes, "At Stettin, we went directly aboard a Swedish boat, beautiful, very clean, and spotlessly white, outside and in." I actually found an image of a steamboat from the Baltic from the 1930s. Here, photo in the middle. As you can see, it is spotlessly white. "I've never seen such a white boat. And all the other people were white too. We were the only dark passengers. But voyagers and crew were so cordial and friendly to us that we might well have been royal guests. The trip across the Baltic to Helsinki was almost like a fairy tale journey on a boat filled with amiable people. The only thing they neglected, being Scandinavians, I guess they did not know, was to tell us about smørgåsbord. Nobody told us that all the creamed potatoes, smoked ham, sardines, salads, sturgeon, hot dumplings, stuffed rolls, and other beautiful things to eat, spread buffet style on a long white table in the big white dining room preceding dinner, were not intended for dinner. So at our first meal, we made the mistake which many foreign travelers in Scandinavia make. While everybody else waited for us to finish, we ate our fill of these wonderful foods, intended merely for appetizers. Then dinner was served." You see, this is what I meant with his humor. And let me tell you, I've many times taken ferries across the Baltic Sea, because I grew up near the Baltic Sea, and it's still like that. You have these amazing buffets on these beautiful white ferries. There's one at the bottom here of the Stena line that connects Germany with Sweden. And if you ever have the chance to go on a crossing, you should absolutely do it. You will not regret it. And then he arrives in Moscow. He writes, "In Moscow, we were quartered in the Grand Hotel, a block from the Kremlin, in the heart of the capital. It had enormous rooms with huge pre-Tsarist beds, heavy drapes at the windows, and deep rugs on the floors. Most of the tourists then coming to Russia were housed at the New Moscow or the National," those are hotels, "and sometimes a few Americans stayed at the Metropole. But that aristocratic old hotel seemed to be reserved largely for important political visitors from lands other than the USA. ballet dancers and beautiful but mysterious girls whom some said were Secret Service agents. At any rate, the Metropole seemed to be the only hotel in Moscow with any bar stool girls about. It was also the only hotel with a jazz band and pretty women available with whom to dance. Let me tell you, those mysterious girls were Secret Service agents. The Metropole is really, really, really famous as a place where especially agents working for the Comintern or the Communist Party would congregate, would stay, and many a great novel and memoirs have been written about the Metropole. You should Google it. It's fascinating. The Metropole predates the USSR, so it was built in the late 19th century, beautiful architecture, and it's still there in Moscow today, so you can stay there if you were to go. It's been beautiful, renovated, and it's just as splendid as it used to be in those days. And then he writes, of all the big cities in the world where I've been, the Muscovites seem to me to be the politest of peoples to strangers. But perhaps that was because we were Negroes, and at the time, with the Scottsboro case on worldwide trial in the papers everywhere, and especially in Russia, folks went out of their way there to show us courtesy. On a crowded bus, 9 times out of 10, some Russian would say, Nigrochansky tovarish, Negro comrade, take my seat. The Scottsboro case, you've probably learned about it in American history classes. It's of course an infamous miscarriage of justice involving 9 African-American boys falsely accused of raping 2 white women. And I think what's really interesting is that this case was followed closely all over the world, and as Langston Hughes points out, maybe especially so in the Soviet Union. What else does he tell us? You know, the book is just so full of anecdotes and interesting passages. I think you all will be able to pick out some really interesting ones. But let's look at this one, because he, of course, takes a train to another big city, Odessa, and he writes, in Odessa, we were housed in a charming hotel near the sea, where an electric fountain fell and varicolored spray at dinner in an open-air patio. Odessa was a deluxe Soviet resort for higher echelon workers, and its hotels were very beautiful. I had never stayed in such hotels in my own country, since, as a rule, Negroes were not then permitted to do so. Besides, I had never had enough money for such fine living in America. And here you have another travel poster of Odessa. And again, I think this is really interesting because he's just observing. He says, you know, these beautiful hotels, I was able to stay there as a person of color, but also as a person who doesn't have much money, because race does not matter, but also, and to stay in these hotels is not necessarily decided by who has the most money, right? This idea, you know, who most deserves it. And workers in the Soviet Union were, of course, given privileges they were not given in capitalist countries. So I think this is really one of the values of his travelogue, is that he just tells us what he sees, how he experiences these things, and you know, he's not even necessarily trying to judge them. He says it's just, this is how it happened, this is how it happened to me, this is how I experienced it. Now, what happened to the movie they had been invited to film? Spoiler alert, if you do not want to know what happened and you'd rather just read the story, then please fast forward a couple of minutes, because the next passage is kind of gonna tell us what happened. So the correspondent, he quotes from a newspaper here, understands that the Soviet authorities suppressed the film for fear that its appearance would prejudice American opinion against the Soviet Union. Since the occupation of Manchuria by Japan, the Soviet authorities more than ever have been eager for rapprochement with the United States as a means, among other things, of strengthening the position of the USSR in the Far East. And I only picked this passage because it so interestingly connects to our topic from last week, right? The Japanese imperialist expansion into Manchuria, the conflicts that had caused first with Russia, then with the Soviet Union, and how the year 1932 was such a pivotal year because the Japanese, of course, only the previous year, right, had provoked that Mukden incident, and in 1932 really took control of Manchuria. So you see how everything Everything is really interconnected. Now, as you will see, Langston Hughes had the chance to stay in the Soviet Union, to travel around, and he jumped on that opportunity. And I included, under additional optional readings, 2 more chapters. One about his travels in the Soviet Union and one his travels to China and Japan, because I think they're so interesting. Now, while he's traveling through Central Asia, he meets somebody there, and I wanted to share that passage with you. The door opened, and an intense-looking young white man in European clothing with a sharp face and rather oily dark hair stepped in. It's the person on the right here in the photo, not the guy in the middle. "Excuse me," I said in Russian as I jumped up. "I thought you were someone else. I don't believe I know your name." "Arthur Kessler," he said in English. "Where from?" I asked, since I'd never heard of him before. "Berlin," he said. "I heard music playing and thought I'd knock. I just got here today." "Well, sit down," I said. "I'm sorry, I haven't got a thing to drink." "I'm not drinking," he said, "but I like jazz." So jazz it was, and that was the end of writing for the evening. I played half of my records. As I played, I learned that he had been to the North Pole with the Graf Zeppelin as a reporter for the giant Ulstein chain of German publications. Now he had come to the USSR to do a series of articles on socialist achievements. When I told him I was a writer too, he asked me what material I had gathered in Ashgabat. I was ashamed to tell him nothing. He had many questions about the city, but I was of little help. "No matter," he said. "We'll start digging up facts together tomorrow. A writer must write." So it was Kessler, really, who started me to work in Ashgabat. He wasn't happy unless he was doing something useful, if happy then. Now, Arthur Kessler is one of the most important German language journalists, intellectuals, later also English intellectuals of the 20th century, an early supporter of communism, who after the Stalinist purges became disillusioned with the communist cause. He wrote a lot. Again, if you're interested, somebody, you should Google. Very, very, very famous. He wrote a very, very important novel called Darkness at Noon, which is really about communism, about Stalinism, about the purges, but also about why so many intellectuals were so drawn to the idea of communism. It's a fabulous, fabulous page-turner. I strongly recommend you to read it. And here you have another photo of the Graf Zeppelin, that beautiful airship. You see, Kessler was so famous as a German journalist that he had been invited to accompany an expedition of the Graf Zeppelin to the North Pole, where the Graf Zeppelin met up with a Russian icebreaker in 1931. And that was such a big event that it even ended up on a Russian stamp. And here you have that stamp. Now, I also included a chapter on Langston Hughes' time in China, which is just as interesting. So he visits Shanghai in 1934. He meets with Sung Qingling, that's Madame Sun Yat-sen, who invites him for dinner at her house. He meets with the famous Chinese writer Lu Xun, in part because he really was a pretty well-known writer, especially for people with a progressive, maybe leftist mindset, and they wanted to meet with him. And then he wrote, "I found the Chinese in Shanghai to be a very jolly folk, much like colored folks at home. To tell the truth, I was more afraid of going into the world-famous Cathay Hotel, today Peace Hotel, than I was going into any public place in the Chinese quarters." And here he's commenting on the international settlement, which was a semi-colonial entity within Shanghai, which was really controlled by Europeans, mostly by British and French. And he says, "Colored people are not welcomed at the Cathay Hotel. But beyond the gates of the international settlement, color was no barrier. I could go anywhere." So again, I think his observations on racism are so interesting, right? He observes that in Shanghai, in these international settlements, white Europeans established color lines that were just as bad as they were in the United States, or worse. Now you might remember that we talked about this play by Tretyakov called Raw China that was written in 1925 and that Langston Hughes had seen in New York in 1930. Now Langston Hughes, after his trip to Shanghai, actually wrote a poem called Roar China. And I'm going to read the first verse for you here. Roar China, roar, old lion of the east, snort fire, yellow dragon of the orient, tired at last of being bothered. Since when did you ever steal anything from anybody, sleepy wise old beast, known as the porcelain maker, known as the poem maker, known as maker of firecrackers? A long time since you cared about taking other people's lands away from them. They must have thought you didn't care about your own land either, so they came with gunboats, set up concessions, zones of influence, international settlements, missionary houses, banks, and Jim Crow YMCAs. They beat you with Malacca canes and dared you to raise your head except to cut it off. If you want to read the whole poem, I've got it here on the PowerPoint, but we are out of time, and I wanted to show you that image. So a year later, in 1935, a Chinese woodblock print artist called Li Hua produced an image that was also called Roar China. And I'm not sure whether it was inspired by the poem or the play, but I think what is really interesting that we see that this progressive socialist art is really transnational, transgresses borders, brings people together in the spirit of the international, right? Of course, we had talked about modernism when we talked about Paul Morand, and we had seen that modernism in the 1920s and 1930s was in a way equally international and transnational, right? So we see the same thing here with this progressive socialist art, and Langston Hughes is very much part of that. Okay, enough for this week. I'm sure you will enjoy your travels with Langston Hughes. Have fun and safe travels.